The heart of the Indonesian jungle is a place of suffocating heat and impenetrable green, a landscape that guards its secrets with a lethal intensity. In 1993, this wilderness became the stage for the greatest gold heist in human history. A heist that didn't involve breaking into a vault, but rather inventing one from thin air. It began with a man named David Walsh, a failed businessman from Calgary whose venture, Bre-X Minerals, was penny stock debris, a company with no assets, no prospects, and a bank account spiraling toward zero. Walsh was a man standing on the edge of ruin until he met Michael de Guzman. De Guzman was a geologist who claimed he had found the impossible, a massive gold deposit hidden deep in the Busang region of East Kalimantan. He spoke of a volcanic dome, a geological anomaly that held the promise of unimaginable wealth. To a desperate man like Walsh, it was a siren song. To the rest of the world, it would become a fever. The early days at Busang were defined by grit and isolation. A handful of men hacking through the primary rainforest, battling malaria and the crushing humidity. But the initial core samples told a story that defied logic. The gold wasn't just there, it was everywhere. As the drills bit into the earth, the results coming back from the lab were staggering. What started as a modest find quickly ballooned into something historic. 5 million ounces, then 30 million, then 60 million. The numbers were growing at a rate that seemed to challenge the very laws of geology. In the boardrooms of Toronto and New York, the name Bre-X began to whisper through the corridors of power like a ghost. Investors who had ignored Walsh months earlier were now clawing at his door, desperate for a piece of the Indonesian miracle. The stock price, once valued in cents, began a vertical ascent that felt like a defiance of gravity. It was the ultimate dream of the CEO and the common worker alike. The idea that a small, independent firm could outmaneuver the giants of the mining industry and stumble upon the largest gold deposit ever discovered. But as the valuation of Bre-X climbed into the billions, a strange atmosphere began to settle over the camp at Busang. De Guzman and his chief geologist, John Felderhoff, maintained a tight grip on the site. Information was controlled, access was restricted, and the core samples, the physical proof of the wealth beneath the soil, were being handled with a level of secrecy that bordered on the obsessive. The world wanted to believe. The Canadian stock market, the pension funds, and the legendary investment houses all looked at the spreadsheets and saw a golden future. They saw a company that had turned the leaden reality of the 1990s economy into pure, unadulterated gold. Yet, beneath the euphoria, there were cracks in the foundation. Some veteran geologists whispered that the gold from Busang looked strange. Its edges were too rounded, its purity too consistent. It looked less like gold formed in a volcanic heat and more like the gold found in a riverbed. But these voices were drowned out by the roar of the market. Bre-X was no longer just a company. It was a religion, and David Walsh was its prophet. The frenzy reached its peak when the Indonesian government, sensing the magnitude of the find, demanded a seat at the table, forcing a shotgun marriage between Bre-X and the mining titan Freeport-McMoRan. The stage was set for the final validation, the moment when the world's most sophisticated mining engineers would step onto the ground at Busang to verify the miracle for themselves. But on a humid morning in March 1997, Michael de Guzman boarded a helicopter bound for the site, and he would never be seen alive again. The helicopter door opened and Michael de Guzman stepped into the humid air, the same air that had fueled a $5 billion empire. But as the rotors cut through the silence of the Indonesian morning, the man who had supposedly found the greatest gold deposit in history chose a different path. According to the official reports, de Guzman plummeted from the aircraft, falling hundreds of feet into the thick, unforgiving canopy of the jungle. When his body was recovered days later, it was unrecognizable, decomposed by the tropical heat and scavenged by the wild. The suicide note found in his belongings spoke of a man crushed by the pressure of his own discovery, a man who could no longer live with the weight of the world's expectations. But in the boardrooms of Calgary and the trading floors of the TSX, the news hit like a physical blow. The architect of the miracle was gone, and the silence he left behind was deafening. The tragedy of de Guzman's death was only the beginning of a much darker sequence of events. Freeport-McMoRan, the American mining giant that had been forced into a partnership with Bre-X, was already on the ground at Busang. They weren't there to celebrate, they were there to verify. Their engineers, equipped with the most advanced technology in the industry, began their own independent drilling. They followed the same maps, used the same coordinates, and dug into the same earth that de Guzman had claimed was saturated with gold. But as the results began to trickle in, the atmosphere turned from clinical to horrific. The gold wasn't there. Where Bre-X had reported massive concentrations of the precious metal, Freeport found nothing but barren rock. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. A find of this magnitude doesn't just vanish, unless it never existed in the first place. As the pressure mounted, the technical reality began to collide with the financial fantasy. The world began to look closer at the core samples that had fueled the frenzy. Under the microscope, the truth started to bleed through the lies. The gold found in the Bre-X samples wasn't volcanic. It was alluvial. It didn't belong in the hard rock of a volcanic dome. It belonged in the silt of a riverbed. More shockingly, the gold particles showed signs of being mechanically filed, rounded edges that suggested they had been processed by human hands before being salted into the core samples. The miracle of Busang was looking less like a geological discovery and more like a laboratory concoction. Back in Canada, the stock was in a freefall. Billions of dollars in market value were evaporating in hours. As the realization dawned that the pension funds of ordinary workers and the fortunes of savvy investors had been staked on a ghost, David Walsh, the man who had once been hailed as a visionary, now faced a storm of litigation and fury. He maintained his innocence, pointing to the death of de Guzman as proof that he, too, had been a victim of a master manipulator. But as the investigators peeled back the layers of the operation, they found a system of deception so simple it was breathtaking. It was a process known as salting, a practice as old as mining itself, but never executed on a scale this vast. De Guzman and his associates hadn't just salted a few holes. They had salted an entire mountain range, using gold dust purchased from local panners, and even shavings from a wedding ring to trick the world's most sophisticated labs. The mystery of Busang was no longer about geology, it was about the psychology of greed. Every check and balance in the financial system had failed because everyone wanted the story to be true. The banks, the analysts, and the regulators had all looked at the evidence through the lens of a gold fever that blinded them to the obvious red flags. But as the truth finally broke the surface, the focus shifted from the lost billions to the missing man. Rumors began to circulate that the body found in the jungle wasn't de Guzman at all, that the man who had orchestrated the greatest fraud in history had staged his own death and vanished into the shadows with a fortune and untraceable assets. The pressure was no longer just about the money, it was about the blood on the hands of the people who had built a mountain of gold out of nothing but dust and lies. The silence in the aftermath of the crash was louder than the roar of the trading floor. As the forensic accountants and independent geologists descended upon the records of Bre-X, the architectural precision of the lie began to emerge. Michael de Guzman had not merely been a geologist, he was an alchemist of the modern age. The investigation revealed that, for years, the core samples shipped from the Indonesian jungle to the laboratories in Australia had been systematically contaminated. It was a manual, labor-intensive process of deception. Every evening, away from the eyes of the junior staff, the samples were salted with gold dust. To ensure the fraud looked authentic, the perpetrators used a variety of gold sources to mimic the natural variations of a real deposit, even using shavings from jewelry to provide the necessary metallurgical signature. The betrayal cut through the highest levels of the Canadian financial establishment. For years, the most prestigious analysts from major banks had visited the Busang site, walked the grounds, and shared drinks with Walsh, Felderhoff, and de Guzman. They had written glowing reports that funneled billions of dollars from teacher pension funds and private savings into a literal hole in the ground. These experts had ignored the most basic red flag. Bre-X refused to allow any third party to conduct split-core testing, a standard industry practice where a sample is cut in half to be verified by an independent lab. By maintaining absolute control over the physical chain of custody, the conspirators had turned a remote jungle outpost into a fortress of fabrication. Behind the scenes, the tension between the partners had reached a breaking point long before the public collapse. Internal memos and leaked communications hinted at a desperate scramble to keep the ruse alive as the Freeport-McMoran merger approached. The arrival of a major partner meant a level of scrutiny that salting could not withstand. The walls were closing in on Michael de Guzman. His sudden fall from the helicopter was the ultimate escape hatch, but it left a trail of unanswered questions that still haunt the industry. Was he a man driven to suicide by the guilt of a $5 billion lie? Or was he a victim of those who needed his silence to protect their own involvement? Or, more chillingly, was the body in the jungle a final, gruesome piece of theater designed to allow a mastermind to vanish? As the truth solidified, the focus shifted to the remaining leadership. John Felderhoff, the man who had stood beside Walsh and trumpeted the discovery to the world, moved to the Cayman Islands, a jurisdiction beyond the immediate reach of Canadian authorities. David Walsh sat in his office, surrounded by the wreckage of a company that had once been the darling of the stock market, maintaining that he was the greatest victim of all. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his legacy. But for the thousands of investors who had watched their life savings disappear into a void of alluvial dust, the claims of innocence rang hollow. The mechanism of the scam was finally exposed. A perfect storm of professional negligence, corporate greed, and a desperate collective will to believe in the impossible. The fuse was lit, and the final explosion would reshape the laws of the financial world forever. The final collapse of Bre-X was not a quiet affair. It was a financial supernova that incinerated $6 billion of shareholder value in a single afternoon. On the Toronto Stock Exchange, the ticker symbol that had once represented the gold standard of penny stock success became a digital tombstone. When the official audit by the independent firm Strathcona Mineral Services was released, the verdict was chillingly brief. The gold at Busang was a fabrication of unparalleled proportions. There was no volcanic dome. There was no multi-million-ounce deposit. There was only a jungle hillside and a trail of salted core samples that had deceived the most sophisticated mining engineers on the planet. The aftermath was a landscape of ruined lives. From the institutional pension funds in Ontario to the retail investors who had mortgaged their homes to buy into the dream, the wealth simply vanished. David Walsh, the face of the company, moved to the Bahamas, where he died of a brain aneurysm only 2 years later, maintaining his innocence until the very end. John Felderhoff, the only executive to face trial, was eventually acquitted of insider trading in a Canadian court, a verdict that left many investors feeling that the legal system had failed them as thoroughly as the market had. Michael de Guzman's death remained a haunting footnote, a body in the jungle that some still believe was a decoy for a man who walked away with millions in his pockets. The historical lesson of the Bre-X scandal serves as a permanent scar on the face of modern capitalism. It exposed the confirmation bias that resides in every corner of the financial world, where the desire for a miracle outweighs the necessity of the truth. It forced a total overhaul of mining regulations, leading to the creation of the NI 43 101 standards, a strict set of rules designed to ensure that a geological fraud of this magnitude could never happen again. Yet, the ghost of Busang still lingers in every high-growth speculative bubble. It reminds us that when a story sounds too good to be true, it is usually because the story is being written by those who stand to profit from the fiction. In the end, the jungle reclaimed the site at Busang. The equipment rusted, the drill holes filled with rainwater, and the silence returned to the East Kalimantan hills. The gold was never there, but the greed that invented it remains a fundamental part of the human condition. The heist was successful not because the thieves were geniuses, but because the world was a willing participant in its own deception. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.